February 1991. A cold desert night stretches across southern Iraq. Silent except for the wind pushing thin lines of sand across the open plain. The horizon is a black wall, empty, unmoving. To the men inside the Iraqi T-72s dug in along the ridgeline, it feels safe, almost comforting. Their engines are silent, their positions concealed. Their guns fixed toward the darkness where they believe the Americans will come. Inside each turret, the crews wait with a confidence shaped by years of Soviet instruction. They believe the night belongs to them. They believe no Western tank can see or shoot effectively in this kind of darkness. And they believe their T-72 with its thick armor and powerful 125mm gun is ready for whatever comes. But then, without warning, the night erupts. A T-72 at the far end of the line bursts into a pillar of fire, hit by a projectile fired from somewhere far beyond visible range. Seconds later, another tank vanishes in a flash of white heat, then another, and another. The Iraqi crews still see nothing. They don't know it yet. But the shells are coming from American M1A1 Abrams tanks, firing from nearly 3,000 meters away. And this is the moment Soviet tank legends begin to die, one burning turret at a time. The story of why Soviet tank crews once laughed at the M1 Abrams begins long before the first shot echoed across the sands of Iraq. It begins in the ashes of the Second World War, when armored warfare was still raw, personal, and brutally simple. The Soviet Union emerged from that conflict with a deep belief: tanks must be built in vast numbers, easy to produce, rugged enough to survive harsh conditions, powerful enough to overwhelm an enemy through sheer momentum. The T-34 had proven this philosophy right. It was not elegant, it was not sophisticated, but it was numerous, fast to manufacture, and lethal in the fore. Hands of determined crews. This shaped Soviet doctrine for decades. When the Cold War intensified, Moscow pushed the same logic into its new generation of tanks, culminating in the T-72 during the early 1970s. The T-72 was engineered with one priority: mass deployment. It had a 125mm smoothbore gun, a compact autoloader system, and armor thick enough to deflect many contemporary NATO rounds. It was designed to be simple and reliable, something a conscript army could operate with limited training. It wasn't the most advanced Soviet tank. That title went to the Ti-64 and later the T-80, but the Ti-72 was the workhorse. The tank meant to fill the fields of Eastern Europe if war ever broke out. NATO analysts respected the T-72's firepower, but noted its weaknesses: cramped interiors, primitive night optics, and limited gun stabilization. But to Soviet commanders, these were acceptable trade-offs. The doctrine did not expect long-range precision duels. It expected overwhelming fire, smoke, maneuver, and speed, the kind of warfare where close engagement decided victory. In contrast, Western military philosophy was shifting. After observing tank battles in the Arab-Israeli conflicts of 1967 and 1973, the United States realized something critical. The next major war would be decided not by numbers, but by who saw the enemy first and who struck the first accurate blow. This realization became the foundation for a new American tank program. The M60 patent, though reliable, was showing its age. The United States needed something radically different: a tank that could dominate at long distances, fight precisely at night, and survive hits from modern Soviet guns. What emerged in 1980 was the M1 Abrams, named after General Creighton Abrams. It introduced a leap in technology seldom seen in armored warfare at the time. Its composite armor, based on British Chobham principles, offered levels of protection unknown to Soviet designers. Its gas turbine engine produced astonishing acceleration. For a tank its size, and most importantly, its fire control system, was decades ahead of what many Warsaw Pact crews had ever seen. This is where the cultural divide began. Soviet tankers, and by extension those in nations equipped with Soviet designs, viewed the Abrams as overbuilt, overly expensive, and overly complicated. A machine too delicate for real war. A tank that drank fuel like an aircraft. A tank that would fail in mud, sand, or winter. In classrooms and training fields, they joked about it. They viewed the T-72 as the sturdier, more reliable, more soldier-proof tank. Their doctrine taught them that NATO tanks were soft targets at long range and untested in large, armored battles. But while Soviet crews trusted in mass and durability, American designers were preparing for something else, a battlefield where visibility, range finding, and first-shot accuracy would decide everything. Throughout the 1980s, as tensions rose, the Abrams quietly underwent rapid upgrades. Better armor, improved ammunition, and eventually the powerful 120mm M256 smoothbore gun. Night vision technology advanced even further. And deep within NATO war games, officers began to realize that the gap between Western and Eastern tank design philosophies was widening every year. Yet on the other side of the world, Soviet advisors continued assuring their allies, especially Iraq, that the T-72 was competitive, deadly even. Iraqi officers, trained under Soviet doctrine, adopted the same confidence. They believed they had the right tank, the right gun, the right armor. What they didn't have was an understanding of how radically different the Abrams truly was. By the late 1980s, the stage was set. Two philosophies of war. Two machines shaped by opposing beliefs, both waiting for the day when theory would be tested against reality, and that day would come. Under the bleak desert sky of 1991, where the first real encounter would expose just how different these machines truly were. By the mid-1980s, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East had become a proving ground for Soviet and Western weapons. Iraq, having fought a long and exhausting war with Iran, had amassed one of the largest armored forces outside the Warsaw Pact. Among the tanks delivered by the Soviet Union were hundreds of T-72s, and later Iraqi-assembled versions such as the Assad Babil. Though simplified and lacking many features of frontline Soviet models, they still carried the name and silhouette of the tank. Moscow had once promised would stand toe-to-toe with NATO armor. Under Soviet advisors, Iraqi tank crews were trained in the fundamentals of armor warfare as understood in Eastern doctrine. Fixed defensive lines, ambush positions, and massed armor held in depth for counterattacks. Their training emphasized quantity over precision, courage over complexity. In Iraqi military culture, the T-72 remained a symbol of strength, a powerful machine that had earned respect across decades of Soviet-era propaganda and real battlefield encounters against weaker regional opponents. But while Iraq clung to the past, the United States was evolving rapidly. By the late 1980s, the M1 Abrams had already seen major upgrades. The M1A1 variant introduced a new 120mm gun derived from the German Rheinmetall L-44, allowing it to fire modern depleted uranium penetrators with devastating effect. Improvements to armor added layers of composite and heavy metals that made the tank nearly immune to the older Soviet 115mm and many 125mm rounds at long distance. And crucially, Abrams' thermal imaging sights capable of distinguishing a tank's heat signature at extreme ranges were becoming the backbone of American armored operations. This set the stage for a technological mismatch that neither Iraq nor its Soviet suppliers fully understood. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, expected a political standoff, not a military confrontation with the United States and its allies. But by January 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched, and coalition forces began a systematic campaign to weaken Iraqi command and control, logistics, and armored concentrations. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Republican Guard, Iraq's best-equipped armored divisions, prepared defensive belts across the desert, placing their T-72s into dug-in positions, hold-down scrapes, and concealed firing zones. Yet these preparations were rooted in assumptions shaped by Soviet experience in Europe that battles would unfold at moderate ranges. That night fighting would be limited, and that enemy tanks would need to expose themselves before engaging. None of these assumptions would survive contact with what was coming. American armored units were training for a different kind of battle, The doctrine known as air-land battle had transformed U.S. operations, emphasizing rapid maneuver, deep attack, and the integration of precision air power with highly mobile armored thrusts. Abrams crews drilled repeatedly in night engagements, long-range gunnery, and coordinated movements guided by reconnaissance assets. They learned to trust their equipment, especially their thermals, their laser rangefinders, the reliability of their fire control systems. To Iraqi tank commanders, these capabilities were theoretical, abstract concepts. Many did not believe. The Americans could see or engage effectively at night. They assumed their own active infrared searchlights, though crude, would be enough for nighttime visibility. What they didn't know was that Abrams crews could see those very searchlights from miles away, glowing bright white through their thermal sights like beacons on a dark stage, as coalition armored columns massed behind the berms along the Saudi border in February 1991. Iraqi crews waited with confidence, strengthened by years of Soviet instruction. They believed they held the right positions. They believed the desert favored the defender. They believed that Abrams was technologically excessive and tactically irrelevant. But the truth was different. The tools that American designers had built, the thermals, the armor, the ammunition, computerized gun controls, were about to overturn decades of assumptions. The moment these two machines finally met, theory would collapse under the weight of reality, and reality would be written in fire across the desert. Floor angle 1, the human angle, inside the turrets for the men who fought inside these machines. The battlefield was defined not by ideology, but by steel, heat, and fear. Iraqi T-72 crews lived in cramped, oil-scented interiors, where every movement was confined by ammunition racks and the tight geometry of Soviet engineering. Most were young. Many came from rural backgrounds. Few had extensive training. There, instructors drilled the basics of loading, firing, and maneuvering. But complex gunnery concepts or long-range engagements were rarely emphasized. For them, the T-72 felt powerful. Its autoloader gave it a sense of modernity. Its reputation, built through decades of Soviet military culture, gave its crews confidence. Yet many Iraqi tankers entered combat knowing little of their enemy's true capability. They had seen photographs of the Abrams. They had heard rumors of its thermal sights. But they did not understand what those systems meant in practice, how they could turn night into day, why they could pick out a tank silhouette through smoke, and how they could track movement invisible to the naked eye. American Abrams crews lived a different experience. Their tanks were spacious by comparison, their training far more demanding, and their confidence grounded not in myth, but in constant drills, maintenance discipline, and repeated gunnery tests under harsh conditions. Abrams crews trained to fight at distances that Iraqi tankers had never practiced. They trusted their optics, their computers, and their ability to hit a moving target with a first shot even in darkness. When these two human worlds collided, the difference in preparation became clear. Iraqi crews fired blindly into the night. American gunners calmly identified targets through glowing thermal outlines. And in those brief moments before destruction, Iraqi tankers felt something they had never expected. They were being hunted by enemies they could not see. It was a human shock long before it became a tactical one. Angle to technology, optics, and fire control. The technological gap between the Abrams and the T-72 in 1991 was not a matter of inches. It was a matter of decades. At the heart of the Abrams' advantage was its thermal imaging system, which allowed crews to see heat signatures at extreme distances. Anything warm engines, metal warmed by the sun, even footprints in cold sand appeared as clear shapes on the gunner's display. This meant that even in pitch darkness, an Abrams could detect a tank hull thousands of meters away and engage it with precision. The T-72 had no such ability. Its night optics were based on early-generation infrared technology, requiring an IR searchlight mounted over the gun barrel. To see, T-72 had to illuminate the battlefield, effectively announcing its own position to any enemy tank with thermal sights. Iraqi crews often avoided using the searchlight at all, preferring to fire blindly into areas where they thought the Americans might be. The Abrams also possessed a laser rangefinder that could measure distance instantly and feed that information into a ballistic computer. This system accounted for wind, tank movement, target speed, and ammunition type, delivering a firing solution within seconds. It allowed the Abrams to hit first, hit accurately, and hit at ranges where the T-72 could barely identify targets. By contrast, T-72 crews relied on optical range estimation, a skill that requires long practice and calm conditions. In the chaos of battle, smoke, heat, haze, fear, accuracy dropped dramatically. At long distances, the T-72's guns struggled to consistently land shots. At night, without proper illumination, many crews simply fired toward muzzle flashes or sounds. The result was inevitable. In open terrain, especially at night, the Abrams always saw first, aimed first, and fired first. Technology did not merely enhance the Abrams. It made its crew effectively invisible until they chose to strike. Angle 3. Armor and ammunition. Armor tells the story of survival, and ammunition tells the story of destruction. In 1991, the Abrams dominated both sides of this equation. Its turret and hull were protected by layers of composite armor, a mix of ceramics, metals, and laminates derived from British Chobham. This armor was designed to defeat both kinetic penetrators and shape-charged rounds. Iraqi T-72s, particularly the export variants and local Iraqi productions, lacked comparable protection. Their armor relied heavily on traditional steel construction. Less capable of stopping modern APF's DS rounds fired at high velocity, the M1A1 Abrams was equipped with the powerful 120mm. Its primary anti-tank ammunition, specifically depleted uranium sabot rounds, traveled at incredible speeds. When these penetrators struck a T-72, the result was catastrophic. The kinetic energy created molten metal spray inside the tank, often igniting ammunition stored around the turret. Many T-72s were destroyed with a single hit, their turrets blown off by internal explosions. On the other side of the battlefield, Iraqi T-72s fired older Soviet ammunition, some dating back years, poorly stored and sometimes degraded. Their 125mm rounds could be lethal at close distance, but struggled to penetrate Abrams' frontal armor at long range. Many Iraqi gunners reported shells bouncing off or simply failing to detonate effectively when they did hit. The difference in survivability was stark. Abrams tanks often endured hits that would have destroyed a T-72, but T-72s rarely survived a direct Abrams shot, especially when struck from 2,000 to 3,000 meters. On a battlefield defined by speed, distance, and lethality, armor and ammunition were not equal, and this imbalance shaped every engagement that followed. But technology and armor tell only part of the story. The true difference lay in how these machines were used in doctrine, leadership, and the mindset that guided them into battle. Angle for doctrine and tactics. Doctrine is the invisible hand on the battlefield. It shapes how crews fight, how commanders maneuver, and how armies interpret the terrain in front of them. In 1991, the doctrines guiding the Abrams and the T-72 could not have been more different. The Iraqi army, trained largely under Soviet influence, approached tank warfare with an emphasis on defensive lines, static positions, and tightly controlled formations. Tanks were often dug into berms or hold-down positions waiting for the enemy to come into range. Their battlefield vision was limited, literally and philosophically, to engagements under 2 kilometers, where firepower and numbers could overwhelm an opponent. Flexibility was minimal. Initiative was discouraged. Commanders expected battles to unfold in predictable patterns. Shaped by firepower and terrain, U.S. armored doctrine took the opposite view. Under airland battle concepts developed in the 1980s, American tank warfare emphasized mobility, initiative, decentralized decision-making, and long-range engagements. Abrams crews trained to fight at night, fight while moving, and strike from distances where enemy tanks could not respond effectively. They were taught to use reconnaissance, terrain advantage, combined arms coordination to break apart enemy defenses before direct contact even occurred. This difference meant that Iraqi T-72 crews often waited passively in positions chosen long before contact. They expected enemy tanks to appear at predictable angles. Instead, they faced an opponent approaching from unexpected directions. Moving faster than anticipated, and firing from ranges far beyond their expectations. Doctrine had turned the T-72 into a reactive weapon. The Abrams was built and trained to be proactive, and once the shooting began, only one doctrine could survive the chaos that followed. Angle 5, the enemy's view. Soviet and Iraqi postmortems after Desert Storm. Analysis began in both Baghdad and Moscow. The results were sobering. Iraqi officers who survived armored engagements reported shock at the distances involved. Many stated that they never saw the American tanks firing at them. Others recounted watching entire companies of T-72s destroyed, without receiving a single accurate return shot. Post-battle inspections revealed penetrations that had sliced through frontal turret armor as if it were thin steel. Ammunition detonations had blown turrets skyward. A grim confirmation of the catastrophic vulnerability of carousel autoloaders storing rounds beneath the crew. Soviet analysts, reviewing the engagement data, immediately recognized the implications. While they had long known that Western tanks possessed superior optics, they had not anticipated the magnitude of the advantage. Thermal imaging, in particular, was a technological leap that Soviet designers had underestimated. Their systems depended heavily on active IR, which was outdated and tactically dangerous against opponents with passive thermal sights. They also noted the difference in ammunition quality. American depleted uranium penetrators drastically outperformed older Soviet rounds still in use by Iraqi units. Combined with ballistic computers and laser rangefinders, the Abrams delivered accuracy that Soviet-era T-72s simply could not match. These postmortems did not blame the Iraqi crews alone. They acknowledged systemic problems: poor training, insufficient maintenance, outdated ammunition, and weak battlefield awareness. But they also highlighted a larger truth: the T-72, in the configuration exported to Iraq, was outmatched by modern Western main battle tanks. For many Soviet officers, the laughter that once followed jokes about American overengineered tanks faded quickly. The battlefield had rewritten expectations, and the rewriting was not yet finished. Angle 6, psychological warfare. When myths die, war is not only fought with guns, it is fought with belief. Belief in your equipment, in your training, in your chance of survival. Before 1991, Soviet-designed tanks carried immense prestige. They had crushed opposition in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and had been exported around the world as symbols of strength. Even in conflicts where they had suffered losses, propaganda and doctrine insisted they were still competitive. With Western armor, but Desert Storm shattered that belief. Iraqi crews, who escaped burning T-72s, described the feeling of being helpless targets. They spoke of unseen enemies, firing with impossible accuracy. They recalled hearing the impact's sharp metallic cracks, followed by the internal roar of exploding ammunition. Survivors who fled their vehicles watched other tanks vanish in pillars of flame, each explosion a reminder that their armor and doctrine had failed them. Word spread quickly in Iraqi units. Morale broke long before physical lines did. Crews abandoned their tanks at the rumor of approaching Abrams units. Some refused to fight at night entirely.
Ow.
Others surrendered before a shot was fired, convinced they stood no chance in a direct engagement. In Soviet military circles, the psychological blow was different. Officers began quietly discussing the technological gap. Designers revisited long-delayed modernization programs. Analysts questioned years of doctrinal assumptions that had downplayed Western innovation. The myth of the invincible Soviet tank, forged in the fires of World War II and carried through decades of Cold War rhetoric, had been pierced cleanly at 3,000 meters, and the next chapter of this story would unfold not in theory, but in the brutal clarity of real combat. These angles set the stage for the moment, where everything converges, where doctrine, technology, and human belief collide under fire. The turning point came on a cold, wind-swept stretch of desert near the Iraq-Saudi border, where American armored cavalry units were advancing through the darkness on February 26, 1991. Among them was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, spearheading the U.S. the 7th Corps' advance. Their mission was simple on paper, yet brutally unforgiving in execution. Break through Iraqi defensive lines, locate the elite Republican Guard, and destroy their armored formations. This sector of the battlefield would become known in military history as the Battle of 73 Easting, a name that echoes through armored warfare like a thunderclap. As night fell, a sandstorm rolled across the desert, reducing visibility for anyone relying on the naked eye. For Iraqi T-72 crews dug into their fighting positions, the storm felt like an advantage. Dust and darkness meant concealment. They believed American tanks would struggle to navigate, much less fight with precision, but their assumption was based on outdated experience, not on the capabilities of the M1A1 Abrams. Inside the American tanks, gunners peered through thermal sights that were completely unaffected by the storm. The swirling dust merely cooled in the wind, making hot objects, engines, turrets, exhaust vents glow brighter through the gunner's display. Iraqi tanks that believed themselves invisible appeared as crisp silhouettes outlined in white. Heat, the difference between the two sides' perception of the battlefield, was not marginal, it was absolute. Shortly after 4 p.m., scouts from Eagle Troop under Captain H.R. McMaster detected movement ahead. What the Iraqis themselves could not see, a column of dug-in T-72s waiting silently in the storm. The distance was extreme, between 2,500 and 3,000 meters depending on position. For Iraqi gunners, this distance might as well have been infinity. For Abrams crews, it was well within killing range. On command, the American tanks opened fire. The first Sabat rounds left the Abrams gun tubes at velocities exceeding a mile per second. They sliced through the swirling dust and crossed the battlefield before Iraqi crews even knew they were under attack. One T-72 erupted in flame, its turret blown skyward. Another vanished in a burst of sparks, then a third, then a fourth. Asterisk within seconds, the carefully prepared Iraqi line was decimated not by close combat, but by precision fire from an enemy they still could not see, to the Iraqi tankers inside their turrets. The experience was surreal. They scanned the darkness in front of them, but the storm obscured everything. Their sights were blind, their rangefinders useless. Some fired blindly in the direction of the incoming rounds. Others did not fire at all. Many remained frozen, unable to understand how they were being hit from such distances. American tankers described the moment in calm, professional terms. Tanks appearing as bright silhouettes, fire commands issued with measured confidence, target after target struck. With first-round accuracy, the Abrams crews were not lucky. They were prepared. As the battle escalated, more Iraqi armor attempted to maneuver, but movement made them even easier to detect through thermal optics. Several T-72s tried to reposition behind sand berms. The heat of their engines exposed them instantly. They were destroyed almost as soon as they moved. The sandstorm that Iraqi commanders once believed would blind the Americans now became the very element that exposed them. The slaughter continued as U.S. cavalry troops pushed deeper into Iraqi lines. The distances remained staggering. Many T-72s were destroyed from well over 2,500 meters, some from beyond 3,000. At those ranges, Abrams penetrators struck with such force that Iraqi crews often never understood what had hit them by the time Eagle Troop pushed through the final defensive line. More than dozens of Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles lay burning across the battlefield. Not a single Abrams from the unit had been destroyed in the exchange. This was not the only engagement of the night nor the most lopsided, but it was the most symbolic. It proved beyond doubt that the Abrams could outshoot, outrange, and outperform the T-72 in conditions that Soviet designers once assumed would level the playing field. Across the desert, similar scenes played out wherever American armored units encountered Iraqi T-72s. The night, once considered a natural ally of Soviet-designed armor, had been claimed decisively by a new kind of tank, and the tankers who survived understood that a new reality had emerged from the dust and fire. The night battles that followed 73 Easting were not merely continuations of the same engagement. they were confirmations of a fundamental shift in armored warfare. The Iraqi Republican Guard, once feared across the Middle East, found itself caught in a technological trap it could neither escape nor understand. As U.S. armored divisions pressed deeper into Kuwait and southern Iraq, the limitations of the T-72, especially export variants, became unmistakable. One of the most defining scenes unfolded near the region known as Medina Ridge, where elements of the U.S. 1st Armored Division advanced toward one of Iraq's most elite tank formations. The Republican Guard's Medina Division had positioned its T-72s along the reverse slope of a ridge, intending to ambush American armor as it crested. The rise. In traditional Soviet doctrine, this was a sound tactic. Force the enemy into close range, exploit elevation, overwhelm with massed fire. But doctrine written in the 1970s could not counter. Technology designed in the 1980s. As American tanks approached, their thermal sights easily detected the heat signatures of the T-72s hidden behind the ridge. Even though the Iraqis could not be seen visually, the thermal images revealed their positions as glowing white arcs of metal. The ridge, intended as concealment, only highlighted their location. Before the Iraqi crews ever saw a single Abrams, silhouette rounds were already incoming, across 2,800 to 3,200 meters. The M1A1 fired Sabah, rounds screaming across the desert like a comet. Through swirling dust, American gunners tracked their shots, watching bright flashes erupt along the ridge as T-72s were struck. In many cases, the Iraqi tanks never returned fire. Their commanders were still trying to determine where the attack was coming from. Some T-72s attempted to reposition, engines roaring as they tried to back over the ridge or rush into new firing lines. But movement was the worst mistake they could make. To the Abrams thermal optics, a moving tank was a beacon of heat. The moment an engine flared or a track shifted, American gunners locked on. Within seconds, another column of fire rose into the night. Meanwhile, Iraqi shells that did fire fell short or went wide. Their optical sights, already limited in daylight, were nearly useless through dust and darkness. Without laser range finding, Iraqi gunners had to guess distances. Under stress, and without visibility, accuracy collapsed. Sabot rounds meant to pierce armor instead, buried themselves harmlessly in sand. The difference in battlefield awareness was overwhelming. American tank commanders observed the fight through panoramic thermal viewers, issuing calm fire orders. Targets were marked, engaged, and confirmed destroyed with professional precision. Radio reports described multiple hotspots: tanks burning, ammunition cooking off, crews abandoning their vehicles. The U.S. formations advanced steadily, maintaining speed, maintaining momentum. The Iraqis, in contrast, found their positions dissolving under fire. Their tanks, designed for mid-range duels, were being obliterated before they could even fight. Several Republican Guard units later reported that their first indication of enemy presence was the impact of sabot rounds tearing through armor for the Iraqi crews. This was beyond demoralizing. It was surreal. Many believed their tanks had suffered catastrophic mechanical failures until they saw the burning wrecks around them. Others assumed that American aircraft must have been responsible, not realizing that the impacts came from tanks firing from kilometers away. Yet the Abrams' dominance was not simply technological. Training, doctrine, and crew proficiency played equally decisive roles. American gunners operated with practiced efficiency. Range, wind, and movement were calculated automatically by the fire control system, allowing crews to fire confidently at long distances. The Abrams turbine engine provided consistent power and smooth tracking during engagements. Even while moving, the Abrams could target with deadly accuracy. By contrast, T-72 crews struggled with worn equipment, limited training, and the stress of an environment where they were blinded long before the first shot was fired. As the battles intensified, the Iraqi lines began to crack. Crews abandoned tanks rather than face the next engagement. Reports from captured soldiers described overwhelming fear, not of death, but of the unknown. They could not see the Americans. They did not understand how they were being targeted. They believed the Abrams had some new technology capable of seeing through everything, in a way. They were right by the time coalition forces swept across the final Iraqi positions. The desert floor was scattered with the wrecks of nearly hundreds of tanks, many of them T-72s destroyed at long range, often with single shots. And when the sun rose on the aftermath, the smoke revealed a truth that no amount of doctrine or propaganda could hide. The T-72, once considered the pride of Soviet export armor, had been decisively outmatched. The Abrams had not just won battles, it had changed the understanding of what modern tank warfare meant. When the guns finally fell silent and coalition forces advanced through the shattered remnants of Iraqi defenses, the scale of the destruction became impossible to ignore. The desert was littered with burned-out holes, scorched turrets, and twisted steel. The skeletal remains of armored formations that once represented the pride of Iraq's Republican Guard. Many of the destroyed tanks still sat in their original firing positions, their barrels fixed toward the direction they had expected the Americans to appear. But they had never seen the enemy who struck them, coalition reports, later declassified and analyzed, painted a stark picture. During the major armored engagements of Desert Storm, U.S. forces destroyed hundreds of Iraqi tanks, including many T-72s, while suffering remarkably few losses of their own. Most of the Abrams losses recorded were due to friendly fire or mechanical mishaps, not enemy action. In direct tank-on-tank combat, Abrams emerged with an almost unprecedented kill ratio. This was not because Iraqi crews lacked courage. Many fought bravely within the limitations of their training and equipment. The truth lay in a combination of factors: outdated optics, inferior ammunition, rigid doctrine, and tanks that had not kept pace with modern battlefield demands. Export T-72 variants lacked the most advanced Soviet armor packages. Their ammunition was often years old, poorly stored, or not designed to penetrate modern composite armor at long range. And their fire control systems were relics of an era when duels were expected to be fought at short distances. Post-battle examinations of T-72 revealed consistent patterns. Most had been penetrated from the front, the strongest part of the tank, at distances far greater than their effective engagement range. Many showed signs of catastrophic internal explosions caused by strikes to ammunition stored in the autoloader carousel. This vulnerability had long been recognized by designers, but it was considered an acceptable trade-off for compactness and rate of fire. On the desert battlefield, it proved fatal. American analysts noted something else. Iraqi units often lacked the ability to repair or maintain their tanks properly. Many T-72s suffered from degraded sights, malfunctioning stabilizers, and worn gun barrels. Against an opponent like the Abrams, whose crews drilled constantly, who maintained their equipment meticulously, and who trusted their tanks implicitly, the gap became overwhelming. For the Soviets observing from afar, the results were sobering. They had assumed that NATO armor would struggle to penetrate well-positioned T-72s, especially at long range. They had underestimated the impact of thermal sights and laser rangefinders. They had not foreseen how quickly modern APF's penetrators could defeat steel armor, even at distances beyond 2,000 or 3,000 meters. And perhaps most importantly, they had not understood how doctrine shaped outcomes, how American combined arms integration allowed tanks to operate with maximum efficiency, knowledge, awareness, and support. As reports filtered back, a quiet realization began forming within Soviet military circles. The assumptions that had guided decades of tank development were no longer reliable. The T-72, once exported proudly across the world as a symbol of Soviet engineering, had been revealed to have critical vulnerabilities when confronted by a peer-level modern tank used with expert proficiency in Iraq itself. The psychological impact was devastating. Crews who had survived engagements recounted how they felt overwhelmed and helpless. Many spoke of tanks exploding before anyone understood they were under attack. Others described the eerie sight of thermals picking out targets in complete darkness, a capability they had never imagined possible. The battlefield had delivered its verdict. The consequences would reverberate through militaries far beyond Iraq. In the months and years that followed Desert Storm, the images of destroyed T-72s scattered across the desert forced militaries around the world to reassess their understanding of armored warfare. What had happened in 1991 was not simply the defeat of one army by another, it was the collapse of an entire generation of assumptions about how tanks should be built, how they should fight, and what mattered most on a modern battlefield. For the Soviet Union, already in its final year, the lessons were difficult to ignore. Analysts quickly recognized that the T-72s used by Iraq represented export and downgraded variants.
Upgrade.
But even this explanation could not fully obscure the reality exposed by Desert Storm. Western fire control, thermal imaging, and modern ammunition had opened a technological gap far wider than many Soviet planners had anticipated. The export T-72's weaknesses were magnified under the harsh scrutiny of real combat. And while more advanced Soviet tanks like the TIT and late-model T-72s had better capabilities, the underlying doctrine remained vulnerable. These observations triggered internal debates that would continue into the era of the Russian Federation. Designers pushed for enhanced armor packages, improved optics, and new kinetic penetrators. Programs that had been delayed or underfunded suddenly received renewed attention. The eventual development of the T-90, incorporating better protection and improved fire control, reflected an acknowledgement that the battlefield had changed decisively. Later, the Armata project was conceived with even more radical departures from Soviet-designed traditions, a sign of how influential the Desert Storm experience had been. Meanwhile, nations that had relied heavily on Soviet-designed armor scrambled to modernize their fleets. Many sought upgrades involving thermal sights, improved ballistic computers, explosive reactive armor, and better ammunition. Others moved away from Soviet tanks entirely, acquiring Western platforms or hybrid modernization packages. The myth of the invincible Soviet tank, long used as political currency across the developing world, had been irrevocably shaken. On the American side, the victory did not lead to complacency. The U.S. military understood that dominance was never permanent. The Abrams continued to evolve, receiving upgraded armor inserts, improved ammunition types, digital networking systems, and protective measures suited for urban environments. The M1A2 variants that followed integrated what Desert Storm had proven. Situational awareness and long-range lethality were as decisive as armor thickness. American doctrine also reaffirmed the principles that had defined the campaign: maneuver warfare, night dominance, and integrated support from reconnaissance and air power. Strategically, Desert Storm became a case study in modern combined arms warfare. Military academies across the world dissected the engagements at 73 Easting, Medina Ridge, and other battles to understand why the U.S. approach had been so effective. The conclusions were consistent. Precision, training, and technological superiority could outweigh numerical advantage. Trenched positions and older doctrines shaped by mid-20th century thinking. For Iraq, the aftermath was even more profound. The Republican Guard, once the centerpiece of Saddam Hussein's military power, never recovered its prestige. Many of its most experienced tank crews were lost in the fighting. The battlefield wreckage served as a visible reminder of how thoroughly their armored forces had been outmatched. Even years later, the silhouettes of those destroyed tanks remained. Scattered across the desert, physical markers of a turning point in global military history, the world had changed. And armored warfare had changed with it. Tanks could no longer rely on numbers, thick steel, or outdated assumptions about engagement. Ranges the night no longer belonged to those with searchlights. It belonged to those who could see without revealing themselves. And long-range lethality was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. By the time the dust had settled, one conclusion had become unmistakable. The distance between seeing first and dying first had narrowed to a razor's edge. And on that edge, the Abrams had proven itself unmatched. In the quiet years that followed Desert Storm, the desert battlefields remained scattered with the burnt silhouettes of T-72s. Each one a reminder of a moment when the past collided with the future. For decades, Soviet-designed tanks had shaped the world's expectations of armored warfare. They were rugged, simple, and built in numbers meant to overwhelm. Their crews were taught that Western tanks were too heavy, too complicated, too fragile for real war. But in 1991, under the cold desert sky, those assumptions met a new reality. The M1 Abrams had not been designed to win through numbers. It had been built around a different idea, that the first to see is the first to understand, and the first to understand is the first to strike. Its thermal sights, its fire control system, its advanced ammunition, all of these were not luxuries, but answers to a question the future had already asked. And when that future arrived, the results were unmistakable. For the men inside the T-72s, the war was a lesson written in fire. They discovered too late that courage cannot compensate for blindness. No amount of confidence, no amount of doctrine, can change the fact that a tank, unable to see its enemy, is already defeated. Their destruction was not a reflection of their bravery, but of the machines and ideas they had been given. For the crews inside the Abrams, the war affirmed years of training, discipline, and innovation. Their victories were not easy. They were earned through rigorous preparation and the relentless pursuit of technological edge. They proved that modern warfare rewards those who adapt, who learn, and who evolve faster than their adversaries. And for history, the lesson is simple. Wars are not won by myths. They are not won by tradition. They're won by preparedness, clarity, and the willingness to see the battlefield as it truly is, not as one hopes it to be. When Soviet tankers once laughed at the Abrams, they were laughing at an idea they did not yet understand. When the Abrams fired from 3,000 meters away, the laughter stopped, replaced by the unmistakable truth that a new era of armored warfare had begun.